Hello and welcome into a new video. Today we're doing a new one on Dead by Daylight, and as the title suggests, it's going to be a few quick tips against every killer. This is by no means a complete guide. There are definitely other tips that will apply to these, but this is a few I came up with. I hope you enjoy. Right, first one's first. It's the poster boy, Trapper. Now the thing to be wary of with Trapper is obvious trap areas. Killer shack around windows and tight loops. If you're aware of where these traps are, it can make your life 10 times easier when doing loops later on in the game. Also, if you're playing as part of a swoof, get one of the other team members to keep an eye on Trapper to survey where they're placing traps in the first place. It could be incredibly helpful. Right, up next is Wraith. Wraith is a deceptively effective killer if they're used correctly. What you need to be wary of with Wraith, however, is they can go invisible. Whilst they're invisible, they're incredibly fast and very hard to detect. If you're handy with a torch, you can light burn them out of their cloak, not only revealing them, but also buying you a few extra seconds with a stun. As well as this, ideally you want to make sure you're organised as a team and very aware of your surroundings. Up next, we've got Hillbilly. Hillbilly can be a very prickly character to deal with. The key thing with Hillbilly is do not run in straight lines when you're in the open. You become easy fodder for chainsaw attacks. Also, if you can, take them to large objects to loop, like rocks and buildings and stuff. It restricts their ability to use the M2, forcing them into an M1 attack. The Nurse. The Nurse can be a difficult one to deal with. The big thing with Nurse is break line of sight wherever possible. If you can break line of sight, it means they have to guess where you've gone, and 50-50 chance they're not going to get it right. Another thing, if you're good with it, Dead Hard can be quite useful if you time it correctly. And if you get caught very close to the Nurse, you can try running directly at them as they're going to teleport, which will occasionally throw them off and buy you enough time to get away. Up next is fans' favourite, Mike Myers, or as they're known in the game, the Shape. The key thing against Myers is not allowing them to get tier 2 easily. You want to make life as hard as possible, so stay behind objects and be aware of your surroundings so they don't get easy stalk. If they do get to tier 3, don't heal if you're injured. It's completely pointless because they can insta-down you anyway. And if they're an infinite tier 3, play stealth and hope for the best. Up next is Hag. Now Hag is a very slow killer and relies on traps to traverse the map effectively. If you've got a torch, you can burn these traps, stopping them from triggering and allowing the Hag to teleport to you. The usual LNT loops are effective against Hag because of their speed, and Urban Evasion can be effective because you can crouch walk fast over the traps. Here we have the Doctor. The Doctor has a ranged attack that can make you scream, revealing your location. If you take the perk Calm Spirit, however, this completely negates the scream that would usually follow being shocked. You will, however, still be afflicted with madness. And the main tip against the Doctor, pre-drop pallets as merrily as you like. I wouldn't usually advise this, but the Doctor's ability restricts you being able to throw pallets in loops, so get them before they do. Up next is quite a lot of people's favourite killer, the Huntress. Now, the Huntress is very, very strong for two reasons. One, they have got a great ranged attack, and two, they have got great map coverage. In order to counter this, you need to make sure that you're not running around in the open, because that makes you easy fodder, and also make sure that when you're looping, you create as much distance as possible, because if they haven't hit you with the M2, they will hit you with the M1. Up next, we've got the killer that everybody loves to hate, Bubba. Now, Bubba, everybody hates for a reason. They are one of the most effective killers in this game if they're used correctly. In order to counter them, you want to make sure you're looping as effectively as possible, hugging the walls and being very aware of your surroundings, because if you get hit by that M2, you will be immediately downed. And secondly, vaults aren't a strong location for Bubba, so if you take a perk like Lithe, you can make really good distance very effectively. Up next is Freddy, or the Nightmare. Now, Freddy can be quite effective, but the weak spot of Freddy is strong loop areas. They do, however, have two tools to help with this. So the main tip against Freddy is to be aware of obvious locations for snares or dream pallets. Now, I know it's difficult to remember in the heat of the moment, but if you can visualize which pallets you've thrown and which you haven't, it can be really helpful to negate the dream pallets that catch you out. Up next on the list is Pig. Now, the Pig can be very effective, but the one thing to remember is it's not a huge rush to get the trap off of your head. A lot of people run straight to the boxes, wasting a lot of time. Once the trap turns red, that's when you want to make sure you've gotten rid of it, because that is when the trap is active. Another thing to note, whilst the Pig is chasing you, your timer is not ticking away, so don't panic about your head exploding whilst they're trying to stab you. And a final note, if the trap is active when you're trying to escape, you will not be able to leave the gates, so be wary. Next on the list is the Clown. Now, the Clown is honestly a very good and underused killer. They don't really have a massive weakness. The one thing to be aware of is they're very strong in loops, and pallets are your best friend. The pink smoke that they throw with the bottles slows you down massively, so being able to fast vault a pallet is very useful. On top of this, general stealth rules apply. If you can stay out of their way, they can't hit you. And now we've got the Spirit. The Spirit is a very deceptive killer. They've got the ability to teleport. Now, one of the telltale signs of a Spirit coming for you is listening for directional audio. When the Spirit teleports, you'll hear a kind of wispy, windy noise. The louder that gets, the closer they are to you. So pay attention to the audio. And a pretty basic one, but breaking line of sight where possible eliminates the need to engage the killer directly. And next is the killer I think I despise more than any other, the Legion. Now, the Legion is a very effective killer, despite being very annoying, and one of the main counters to Legion is a very well-timed pallet. Whilst they're in frenzy, they can vault pallets, however, so most of them will try to wait out a pallet throw. So if you can time it well and stun them with a pallet, not only do you bring them out of frenzy, you also get extra stun time, on top of draining their power. And up next is the Plague. I personally despise the Plague, as do many people, but they're a very effective killer. The main thing to be wary of is the M2, where they puke all over you. Ideally, you want to get behind objects to try and avoid being sick on, because if they're sick on you enough, and the bar fills up, you'll be a one hit down. If you get close to this point, you can double back on the loop and try and force an M1 to avoid the insta down. And up next is another fan's favourite, Ghostface. The killer with probably one of the best Moris in the game is one of the most difficult to play against. They are all about stealth. The main tips here are to break line of sight where possible, and if you notice Ghosty going into a stalk, use objects to break line of sight. If they get you exposed, you immediately become a one hit down, so it's all about distance and stealth. And for me, the pinnacle of this list, the Demogorgon. The Demogorgon is without a doubt my favourite killer in the entire game. They do, however, have a few telltale signs that you can use to avoid some of their hits. I know it's not a skill that everybody's mastered, but if you can look behind you whilst running, you can see the Demogorgon open their face when they're about to shred. And the best piece of advice playing against the Demogorgon, if you're looping in the open, run in random directions. It throws off the shred massively. And here we have the Oni. Now, the Oni is a very effective killer, providing they can get their M2. The main tip against the Oni, if you get injured, get yourself healed as soon as possible. The longer you're injured, the more blood orbs will drop on the floor. And as soon as the Oni gathers enough blood orbs to launch that M2 attack, if you're in the open, you're a goner. If you can loop well, you can try and force the killer into a loop to give up, but the main point is to avoid feeding them their ability. Up next is the Deathslinger. Deathslinger is yet another very effective killer if used correctly, and the main thing you want to avoid is being hit with that M2 shot. If they hit you with the M2, they will drag you in with the harpoon and not only hit you, but they will cause you to be broken as well, meaning you need to mend and heal, get back to fighting fitness. Like many of the others, breaking line of sight is your best friend, and if you've got good ears, keep an ear out for the ping noise for when he aims down the sights to shoot. And up next is probably one of the best anti-looping killers in the game, Pyramid Head. Pyramid Head is incredibly effective around L&T loops, so don't use those like you would against other killers. This is mainly due to the fact that his M2 ability can go through walls, so the walls mean nothing. Dead Hard can be quite a useful perk if you know when to time it right. And if you see barbed wire trails on the floor, crouch walk over them. It will stop you from becoming entangled and being sent to the cage. And up there with Nurse as one of the best killers in the game is Blight. Blight is very effective due to their speed and unpredictability. If you can, you're going to want to try and match that unpredictability by darting in random directions when they launch a rush attack. If you're lucky, they might go in the wrong direction as a result of going so fast. Though with that being said, small loops are your best friend against the Blight because it essentially restricts them to being an M1 killer due to the fact that the M2 is so hard to launch around a tight loop. And up next is a killer we're seeing less and less of these days, the Twins. There isn't a huge amount to worry about with the Twins. The one thing I will say is to be wary of static AFK looking Victors. You can run up and kick them, but be wary whilst you're in the vicinity of Victor, they are being used as an alarm and Charlotte will know where you are. And another point, you can jump in a locker to avoid an attack by Victor, but you're going to want to get out as quick as possible because Victor can jump on the locker handles and pin you in there, giving Charlotte enough time to come over and grab you out. Here we have the Trickster. One of the coolest in the game, and it's a massive shame they didn't get a map because that would have been really cool. The main thing to avoid with Trickster is the M2 blades. They can cover incredible distances very, very fast, so you're going to want to use obstacles to block those as best as you can. And be wary of the Trickster's ricochet blades. If they have bought the ricochet blades add-on, it can be very, very difficult to dodge those in a loop. And now is a killer I was so hyped for upon release, the Nemesis. The Nemesis has a couple of things to worry about, mainly the zombies. Firstly, you can kill a zombie by slamming a pallet on it, keep that in mind. And secondly, if you're working a gen and a zombie is approaching, you can flashlight blind them to buy yourself a few extra seconds. And when dealing with Nemesis around pallets, keep looking backwards. If you see them bringing the tentacle out, do not drop the pallet, because you're going to have time to get around again. And here we have Pinhead, or the Cenobite, a criminally underused killer in my opinion. And there's only a couple of tips I've got for you, because they're a very strong killer. Firstly, when you solve the box, do it near a loop or a pallet. I don't know why people don't do this more, but if they do teleport to you, it gives you an out straight away. And secondly, try not to run in straight lines. The Cenobite has a very effective M2 that can slow you down and get you very, very easily when you're running in straight lines. And up next is the Artist. This is a killer I really struggle to counter because I've not had much experience due to the fact that not many people play them since release. The one thing I will say is to be very wary of your surroundings, and another, when you're working on generators and you hear the noise of them casting the birds, look in the distance because you can hop off of the generator and hop back on again and not give away your location. And up next is the Onryo. The Onryo's main ability allows them to teleport through TVs. When they do this, they can inflict something called Condemned on you. You need to make sure you get rid of this as soon as possible by taking a videotape from one TV and putting it in the one that the game tells you to. If this Condemned bar goes all the way to the top, you can and will be insta-killed. The thing to note with Onryo though is they have to be physically manifested in order to hit you. So if you see them intermittently, they can't actually attack you until they manifest. And up next is the Dredge. The Dredge is a very unique killer in that they can actually use the lockers, which previous to Dredge were only accessible to survivors. On the subject of lockers, if you see two lockers together, only lock one. The reason for this is when the Dredge teleports to those two lockers, they'll be forced into the locked locker, meaning the next time that they leave the area, you can relock the other one and again lock out those two lockers. A big thank you to Beckalicious for that tip there, I didn't know that myself. And another one to be wary of, yet another locker tip. If you're running a loop and there's a locker in the area, be wary because the Dredge can and will pop out of that locker and hit you on the other side. And finally, the Dredge has an M2 ability to leave a remnant. If you're looping them in a tight area and they leave a remnant on the floor, leave the loop immediately, because if you double back to go to your original position, they'll teleport to the remnant for a nice easy hit. And finally, the biggest pain in the ass we've all been dealing with recently, Wesker. Now, Wesker relies heavily on the M2 in order to get the best out of the killer. Without that, they're an M1 killer. So what you're going to want to do is restrict them to short loops to restrict the ability to use the M2 in the first place. To go along with this, ideally you're going to want to be running in unpredictable directions. That way you make it harder for them to land the M2. And a nice perk to run against Wesker is Quick and Quiet. Whilst you're running in loops trying to avoid the M2, you can very quickly vault a window for a nice easy escape. And that is your lot. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I enjoyed making this massively. It's been my baby over the last week or so. A special shout out to Inferno and Eagle who helped me film this. And until the next time, peace out.